If you're looking for a fun project to build to practice your React skills, we'll be doing just that in this video. We'll practice breaking down a UI into React components. We'll learn how to work with state using the context API, and I'll give you some challenges which you can try at the end. Completed code is available on GitHub if you get lost, and put any questions you have in the comments so I and others can see. Let's get started. Okay, so we're going to start by creating a React project. For this, we're going to use create React app, as this gives us everything we need out of the box to get started without having to set up things ourselves. Go ahead and open up any terminal, navigate to the directory where you want your project to be. In this case, I'm on the desktop, and then we'll just type npx create React app and give it a name. So we'll call this one budget tracker and hit enter. Once that's completed, we're going to type cd budget tracker to change our directory to our new project. Next, we'll install Bootstrap. Bootstrap will give us a bunch of CSS that we can use without having to create our own style sheets. So go ahead and type npm I bootstrap and hit enter. Next, we'll install a package that helps us generate some IDs. So go ahead and type npm I UUID and hit enter. Finally, we'll install a package that gives us some icons so we don't have to create them ourselves. So go ahead and type npm I React-icons. Hit enter, and that's it. Our project's ready to go. So now I'm going to open this up on Visual Studio Code. So if you go into Visual Studio Code and open the folder that we just created, so it should be called budget tracker, and we're going to go into the source folder and just delete some things that we don't need. So we're going to delete app.css, app.test.js, index.css. We're going to delete the logo, report web vitals.js, and setup tests.js. So go ahead and delete those. And now we're going to go into index.js. We're just going to remove some of these references that we no longer need. So we'll delete import index.css. We'll delete import report web vitals, and we'll delete this stuff at the bottom here as well. So go ahead and save that. Next, we'll jump into app.js, and we're just going to delete everything from here and start from scratch. So the first thing we'll do is we'll import React from React. Next, we'll import the Bootstrap style sheets. So go ahead and type import bootstrap /dist/css /bootstrap.min.css. Finally, we're just going to create an app component to test that our project compiles and that the hot reloading and things is all working as planned. So we'll type const app is equal to an arrow function, and then type return, open some braces. Inside the braces, we're just going to add a p tag with some text. It says hello React. And lastly, we're going to do export default app. Hit save. And now if we go down to the bottom of VS Code and then click on terminal, we're just going to do npm start. And all being well, this should start our application in Chrome or your default browser, and it should say the text which we put in, which is hello React. So that's our project all set up and ready to go. Okay, so now that our project is set up, we'll start by putting some of the UI elements in place that we need with some hard-coded data. This helps us visualize the state objects and the different data that we'll need, which we'll add later in the tutorial. So if we have a look at the complete example that you can get from GitHub, check the description for the links, you can see what we're going to build. We'll start at the top and just work our way down. So the first thing we want then is a title. So if we jump into app.js, we're just going to delete this paragraph tag, and we'll open our braces and inside start by adding a Bootstrap container by saying class name equals container and close this. This helps us center everything in the screen and gives us nice margins where it makes sense. Within this, we'll just add a h1 tag, and we'll give this a class name of mt3. Mt stands for margin top, and inside this h1, we will say my budget planner and hit save. And we'll jump back to our own app just to see if things are working, and they are. Next, we'll add these three boxes that display different information about the budget, the remaining budget, and spend so far. Because we're using Bootstrap, this will be responsive, so as we go onto the bigger screens, things will drop onto the same line, and as we go back to the small screen, things will stack above each other. So let's start with this. If we go into app.js, take a new line just under our heading, and we're going to type div and give this a class name of row and mt3. So this will give us a Bootstrap row, which helps with the responsive layout. Within this div, we're going to create another div with a class name of call-sm. So this is a column within a row. Again, this just helps with the responsiveness of it all. The first component we're going to create which we haven't created yet, is going to be the budget component. So this will show the user's budget. So if we go into our source tree, under the source folder, we're going to create a new folder. This one's going to be called components. Within this, we will create a new component. So add a new file called budget.js. And in here, we'll create a React component. So we'll do import React from React, and we'll create our function. This is going to be an arrow function as usual, and we'll type return, open some braces and take a new line. To get this grey rounded background effect, we're going to use a Bootstrap alert. So we'll create a div and we'll say class name is going to be equal to alert-secondary. Within this div, we're going to take a new line and we're going to open a span tag, and then we'll just type budget : add a currency symbol, and then we'll just type a number. So for now, we'll say 2000. So again, we're hard coding our GUI elements in place, and we will take these values from context eventually. So the last thing that we need to do is do export, and back in app.js, we just need to import this. So at the top, type import budget from ./components/budget. Now, if we go into Chrome and check that this works, you can see it's appeared. So we're going to add the edit button in towards the end of this tutorial, but for now we're just going to continue with the rest of these boxes. So the next component we need is the remaining component. So again, we'll jump into our code, into source components folder, add a new file, call it remaining.js, and we'll create a React component as usual. Import React from React, and I'll say const remaining is equal to an arrow function, and we're just going to return, take a new line and add a new div, and we'll give this one a class name of alert, and this alert is going to be a success alert so that we get the green color. Take a new line within this div, add a span this time, and inside this we'll take a new line and we'll type remaining, add a currency symbol, and then we'll say 1200, and we'll export this component, export default remaining, and save. And if we jump back into app.js, we are going to create a new column just below the budget column. So around line 12, you want to take a new line, add a div, give it a class name of call sm, and within this, we'll just add our remaining component. Sometimes Visual Studio Code will automatically import it for you, and sometimes it won't, so just make sure that you've imported the component at the top of the file. So we'll save and check this in our browser, and it's working. If we jump back to the complete example, we have one more to go. So this is the spent so far, which is essentially the total of all our expenses, which we'll get to in a minute. So we'll jump into source components folder, add a new file. This one will be expense total.js. Then we'll create a component, import React from React, and we'll do const expense total is equal to an arrow function, and we're going to return a div similar to what we've done before. It's going to be a class name of alert primary, which gives us the blue color, and within this we'll type a span and say spent so far will be, open a currency symbol and type a number. We'll say 1200, and I will just export default expense total like so. Okay, and then if we jump back to app.js, we'll just add the final column similar to what we've done already. Around line 16, just take a new line, add a div with a class name of call sm. Within this, it's going to be our expense total component. Let's check this in the browser, and we have our three components because we've used a Bootstrap grid system, which is a combination of rows and columns. If we expand this window out, we should get a nice responsive page, and we do. So we just bring it back to small. So let's look at our complete example. If we scroll down, the next thing we need to do is add the expenses list. So this is going to contain all our expenses with a name and a cost with a little delete icon here as well. We're going to come back to this type to search thing later on, so we'll not worry about that right now. So if we go into app.js, around line 21, I want to take a new line, and then we'll do h3. So this is just going to be for us expenses subtitle. Say class name equals mt3, and within this we'll say expenses. like so. And we'll check our Chrome again to make sure it's working. It is. If we jump back to our complete example, we want to create a list of things. We'll do a separate component for this. So we'll create the component first, and then we will call it within app.js as we've done so far. So let's go into source components, add a new file, call it expense list.js, and we will import React from React. We will create our component. It's going to be an arrow function, and add some curly braces. What we're going to do to make sure that things are working is create a dummy or hard-coded lists of expenses. We will render this dummy list out in our JSX. So if we type const expenses equals an array, since we're working with lists, it's a good idea to use an array. And each object in this array is going to contain different things that we need to know about a given expense. So if we open our curly braces to indicate we want an object, and then we'll say an ID, because we need to know what the ID is. So we'll just give it a dummy number for now. We'll need to know the name, which will be a string. In this case, we'll just say shopping. And we need to know the cost, which in this case is going to be 50. And outside the last curly brace, we'll say a comma, because we want to do a couple of these. So we will copy this a few times, and we're just going to hard code some of this data as is seen in the complete example here. So don't worry too much about the ID for now. This will come into play whenever we're working with the actual delete, but for display purposes, it doesn't really matter what this value is. So we'll change some of these around. So we'll say holiday. That's going to be 300, and then we'll say transportation. It's going to be 70. Fuel is going to be 40. So we're just taking this as we see it here, and the last one's going to be childcare, which will be 500. Now we'll hit save. Now what we're going to do is render these expenses out in our JSX. So we'll type return, open some braces, and then we will add a UL, which is a list. Within this, we're going to open our braces to indicate that we want to execute some JavaScript now. We'll say expenses.map. Remember, the map function is used to blip over an array of objects. We'll pass in a function, which gives us access to the current expense that the map function is currently on. Then we're going to open some braces in here, and then we're going to render an expense item. So we haven't created this component yet, but what this will do is accept some values as props and display those values onto the UI. We need to pass some things as props. So to do that, we'll pass in the ID, the name, and the cost as props. So we say ID equals expense.id, name is equal to expense.name, and cost is equal to expense.cost. Okay, so far we have a list blipping over the expenses array, and we're passing some details to an expense item component as props, which will then render onto the screen. So now we need to create this expense item component. So if we go into our source components folder, add a new file, call it expense item.js, and this will be a React component. We'll create a function, and this is going to be equal an arrow function, and this time we're going to accept props. Open our curly braces, and then we'll type return, open some braces, add a space, or take a new line, and then we're just going to type li, since this is a list item. Within this, we'll give this a class name of list group item, and then we'll say d-flex. So this is a bootstrap class that lets us say that this is a flexbox container, and then we'll say justify content between and align items center. So again, these are just some bootstrap helper classes that lets us align things as we see them in the complete example here. Okay, so within our li tags, we want to open some curly braces and type props.name, like so, which is going to be the name of the expense, which we take from props, and it gets passed in from the expense list component as a property here, or as a prop here rather. Okay, so next we'll take a new line, we'll add a div. Inside this div, we'll add a span, and this is going to be the cost. So we'll give this one a class name of badge to give us the blue background, and it's going to be badge primary, and we'll say badge pill, and then we'll say MR for margin bright and we'll give it a value 3. Inside the span, we're going to add a currency symbol, and then we're going to take the cost of this expense from props. So remember, we passed the cost in as well from expense list to expense item as a prop here. So that means we can do props.cost. Finally, we just want to render out a delete icon for each expense item. For this, we will type ti delete and say size equals 1.5 em. Like so, and then just close that. This needs to be imported from the React icons package that we installed at the start. So at the top, type import, open curly braces, type ti delete from React icons /ti, like so. And finally, we just need to export this component. So export default expense item, like so. And that looks good. So now we'll jump back into expense list. This is saying an error because it's not defined, which means we haven't imported it yet. So we just import this, import expense item from, let's see, is it ./expense item, and save. Okay, now our error's gone away. We still have one here that says expense list is declared, but its value is never used. So we'll just export it then. Export default expense list. And the final step we need to do is jump into app.js. And we just need to render our expense list within app.js. So just below our h3 tags, we take a new line and we're just going to add a bootstrap row like we've done before. So say div class name is equal to row mt3. Within this, we'll just add a column. So div class name is equal call sm. And finally, we will render our component. So expense list. Like so. And now if we save, we check our app in the browser and it's appearing, but things look a bit funny. So let's firstly check the expense item. And yeah, so we want this delete to be outside of the cost, but I've included it inside this span. So all we have to do is cut this from here and paste it just outside. Now if we save, hopefully that fixes one thing. Okay, and then we want to fix this space as well, so let's investigate that. Let's go to expense list, and yes, so we need to add a class to our list, and then we'll just say class name equals list group, like so, and save, and it's fixed itself. Okay, the joys of CSS. The last thing that we need to do is put our add expense form in place. So if we look at the complete example, we have an input for the name and an input for the cost, and then we have a save button as well. So let's go ahead and add this component. So we jump back into the code, go to source components, we'll call this add expense form .js, and then we'll do import React from React, and then we'll say const add expense form is equal narrowed function, and then we will type return and open our braces, and we will open a form tag. So again, we'll use bootstrap rows just to make sure that each form thing goes on to its own row. So we'll add a div with a class name of row. Within this, we'll add a div for the column, call sm, and then inside this we'll add a label for the input label field. So it'll be label like so, and then it'll be for. So this is going to be for the name value, and then we'll say name in here, and then input is going to have a few properties. So we'll say required. This will be a required field, so we'll type required. The type is going to be free text, and the class is going to be a bootstrap form control, and then we'll just give it an ID of name as well. So we'll save this. This will give us the name input. Next, we just need to do one for the cost. So around line 15, we just want to create a new column in this row. So it's a div with a class name of call sm. And inside, we're going to add a label for this one too. And it's going to be for the cost value. We'll just add cost in as a string as well. Next, type the input. It's going to be required, just like the previous one. The type is going to be text. Class name is going to be form control, and an ID is going to be cost, like so. And lastly, we just need a column for the button. So we'll do div class name is equal to call SM, and we're going to add a button in here, which is going to have a type of submit, which means whenever the button's clicked, it will submit this form. And we're going to say class is equal to button primary, and we'll add some text to say save. And that's our form elements in place. So we just need to export default add expense form. And now we just have to render this in our app.js. So around line 28, we want to take a new line. We're going to add a h3, and this is going to have a class name of mt3. So that's a margin top of 3. We'll add a title, add expense, and on the next line, we'll add a column, or a row first rather, so mt. And on the next line, we'll add a row, with a column. So div class name equals call SM, and within this we will render our add expense form like so, and just double check that it's been imported, and it has. So now if we check our browser and scroll down, okay, so now that we have our UI elements in place, we can create the context, which is going to hold our global state. So if we go to source and add a new folder, we'll call this one context. Within this, add a new file, call it app context.js. So in app context.js, the first thing we want to do is set up the initial state, which our context will use when the app loads. So we'll type const initial state is going to be equal to an object. So we'll open some curly braces, and we're going to need to store the budget. So we'll type budget colon and then give it a value. We're also going to need to store the expenses as an array. So we'll open some square braces, take a new line, open some curly braces, and then we'll say ID is equal to a random number just for now. And then the name of the expense, in this case, is going to be shopping. Cost is going to be 50, and that should be it for one expense. So just after the last curly brace, we're going to type a comma and just duplicate this and change some of these values around. We'll change the name to holiday, and the cost will be 400. So this should be enough to get us started. Okay, so next we're going to create a context. This is the thing our components import and use to get the state. So to create this, go to the top of the file, type import, open our braces, type create context from React, just like so. Now down at the bottom of the file, we'll do const app context is equal to create context, open and close brackets, and save. So this is saying to React they want to create a context and assign it to the app context variable. And since we have external components that need to get access to this, we have to export this. So just type export at the start of the statement. Okay, so now we have a context created. We need to create a provider. So the provider wraps the components which we want to pass certain state values to. So this is just a function. So we'll type const app provider. It's going to be equal to an arrow function which accepts some props. Open our curly braces and take a new line. So the app provider is the bit that holds the state and passes it to our components. So in order for it to hold the state, we're going to use the use reducer hook. So at the top at our import statement, just beside create context, we'll do a comma and type use reducer. And in app provider, we'll type const open square braces, type state slash dispatch. It's going to equal to use reducer open and close brackets. So whenever we use the use reducer hook, it's similar to the use state hook in that it gives us the current state and also a function to update the state. In this instance, it gives us a dispatch function, which we'll use to dispatch actions. Whenever we call the use reducer hook, we have to give it two things. We have to give it a reducer, which we haven't created yet, and we have to pass to it the initial state. So just type initial state. Whenever the app first runs, this state object is going to be equal to whatever the initial state is. Okay, so now we'll create the reducer. The reducer is in charge of actually creating the new state object based on the actions that it receives. So above our import statement, just type const app reducer. It's going to be equal to an arrow function, and this accepts the current global state, which gets passed in by React, and an action, which gets passed in by our dispatch function. So we'll open our braces, and the reducer uses a switch statement to determine exactly how to change and update the state. So it does that by checking the action.type, and then depending on the action type, it could do a number of different things. So for example, when we come to add an expense, we'll have a add expense action here that updates the state, or if we come to delete an expense, there will be a delete expense action. But for now, since we're just getting things set up, we're just going to return the default state by typing default : take a new line, return state, and we'll add new actions to this reducer as we need them throughout the tutorial. Okay, so now we have our initial state, we have our app context, we have our state object, which is connected to the reducer. The reducer is going to be in charge of returning different state or new state depending on the actions that it receives. The last thing we need to do is just return some of these state objects from our app provider so that the connected components can get access to them. Just below the reducer code in app provider, we're going to type return, open an angle bracket, type app context dot provider, and then we'll close this, and the app context dot provider component takes a value prop. So this value prop can be anything that we want our connected components to have access to. So in this case, we're going to create a new object, which is going to pass down certain state values. The things we want to pass to our components are the budget. So we'll type budget : state dot budget, comma. We'll also want to pass the expenses. So we'll say expenses state dot expenses. And we'll also want to pass the dispatch function, which lets our components dispatch actions, which will trigger the reducer, which will update state. Just between our app context.provider tabs, we want to render the children. So we'll say props.children. So what this is this is any nested components that we will have inside our app provider, which you'll see in a second. And just to finish up this app context file, we just need to export our app provider. So we'll just type the export keyword before the function. Okay, so now our context is set up. We need to connect it to our application. So if we go to app.js, we'll import the app provider, open some braces, type app provider, and just outside the last brace, type from, open SweetWorks ./context/app context, like so. Now down in our app function, just after the return statement starts, we will open an angle bracket, type app provider, and then we'll close this. Then we'll take a few lines just inside. So now what we want to do is copy all our existing code from the top div right to the bottom. Then we're just going to cut this, and then we're going to paste it inside our app provider. So now all our components that we've created so far, the budget, the remaining, etc., all have access to the context because it's inside the app provider. So just to double check that things are all working as intended, if you go to your browser, inspect the DevTools, and if you go to the Components tab, if you click on context.provider, you can see the value object which we created as part of our app context. And the different things all appear here. So we said we wanted to export the budget, the expenses, and the dispatch, and they all appear here. So our context is now set up. We can start connecting our different components to context and display the different bits of data that we need. Okay, so now that our components are wrapped in the provider, we just need to connect our components to context so we can pull the different state values out. So we'll start with the budget. If we go into budget.js, you can see that we've hard-coded a value. So this is what we're going to replace with the value from context. So the first step is to import our context. So type import, open some braces. Inside this, we'll type app context. Outside the last brace, type from ... context/app context. In order to use this context in our component, we'll need the use context hook. So we'll import this from React. So just beside our React import, do a comma, open some braces, and type use context. Now in our budget component, we can use destructuring to get the budget state value out of the context. So type const, open some braces, type budget. Outside the last brace, type equals use context and pass in our app context. Remember, we exported the budget as part of the value object in our provider. So here's the budget, which you get from state, and then we're just passing it through the provider into our component. We just use destructuring to get this out and assign it to a variable called budget. So now all we need to do is, instead of our hard-coded value in here, we will open up some curly braces and type budget. Now, if we save this and check the browser, you can see that the budget still says 2000. So if we go into app context and change the budget to something else, say 1000, refresh in Chrome, and you can see that it changes. So we'll just change this back to 2000 and that's it. So now our budget comes from context. Next, we're going to do a similar thing with the expenses. So instead of displaying a hard-coded list of expenses, we're going to take them from context. So we'll jump into expense list.js. So as you can see, we have our hard-coded list of expenses, and we're doing some work down here to display each item in the expenses array as an expense item component. We've done most of the hard work here. All we have to do is, instead of using this dummy list, we import our context as we did before. So we'll type import app context from /context/app context, like so. And we'll also need the use context hook, which you get from React. So as part of the import for React, type use context inside some braces, like so. And inside our expense list component, we'll type const expenses is equal to use context, and we'll pass in our app context. That means we can delete this. And now if we save, we see the two items, or the two expense items, have now come from context. So if we just have a look at our initial state, we've said we want to use two expenses, one called shopping, one called holiday, and this value gets passed as expenses as part of the provider, which means our component gets access to it. So just to prove this works, if we add a third one and call it car service, have a cost of 50, and just refresh the browser, you can see this appears. So the reason we have to refresh when we change the initial state is because this only gets loaded when the app fires or starts for the first time. Okay, so now that we have an idea on how to get some data from our global state in context, next we're going to have a look at how to add an expense, which will involve dispatching an action into context and updating our expenses list that lives in there. So if we go to add expense form.js, so before we can save the new expense to state, we need to know what value that the user has typed for the name and the cost. We're going to use some local state objects which will hold the values for each of these text fields. Just above the return statement, we're going to type const name, comma, and then type set name. This is going to be equal to use state. So this is just a local state variable which we'll set to be an empty string. And we need to import use state from React, like so. So we need to do the same for cost. So we'll type const, open our braces, type cost, comma, set cost is equal to use state. And again, we'll set this to empty string. So in the name input, we're going to type value is equal open braces, and it's going to be equal to name. And whenever the input changes, we're going to create a function or pass in a function here that takes the event and calls the set name updater function, passing in the event target value. So all we're doing here is whenever the user types something into the name field, it's just going to save it as part of the name state object. And we'll just do similar for the cost. So in the input tag for the cost, take a new line and type value is equal to cost. And we'll do an onChange event as well. So similar to what we did before, equals open braces, and we'll pass in a function which takes the event. And this will be an arrow function that we'll call set cost, and it'll take the value from the event.target.value. Okay, so now we know the name and the cost. The next thing we want to do is add a onSubmit function to our form that gets called whenever the button is clicked. So to do this, we'll do const onSubmit equals event, and again this is going to be an arrow function. In here we can do whatever we want because it's just a normal function, but for now we're going to type event.prevent default. This will stop the page from reloading whenever the button is clicked. Then we're just going to do alert, and then we're going to say name plus the name, and we'll add an empty space, and then we'll just add a cost. So we'll say cost plus the cost. So all we're doing is just checking that our button correctly fires from the form and that our on submit gets called correctly and alerts whatever values the user has typed in. So we just need to go to our form tag, type on submit equals, open our braces, on submit. This just says whenever the form gets submitted, call this function. So if we go to our app in Chrome or your browser, and then we type, let's say we add a, say, pizza, and the cost will be 40. And now if we save, you can see it says name is pizza and the cost is 40. So we're just missing some spaces here, but in general, it seems to be working okay. Okay, so now we know that our onSubmit's working and it's capturing the values correctly. Now the next step is to update the onSubmit function so that it dispatches an action to tell context to update the expenses list with whatever we typed in here. We're going to start by importing our context. So type import, open the braces, type app context from /context/app context. And again, we'll need to import the use context hook from React. So we'll type use context, and just on the first line of our add expense form, we'll type const dispatch, because this time we're going to be dispatching an action. So we can get dispatch out of context the same way as we've done so far. And this is just going to be equal to use context, and we'll pass in our context. Okay, so now in our onSubmit, what we're going to do is create an object which is going to represent an expense. This is what will get sent along with the dispatch action as the payload. So we'll type const expense. It's going to be equal to an object. So now we'll say the name is equal to the name. The cost, we're going to say parse int, because at the minute it's just a string, cost, like so. Now, if you remember back to our initial state in app context, we also have an ID. This is a good time to generate an ID every time an expense is added. To do this, in our expense object back in addExpenseForm.js, we'll type ID UUID v4 and open and close some brackets. And then at the top, in our import section, we'll do import v4 as UUID v4 from UUID, like this. All this is doing is every time this function gets called, it's going to generate a random ID for us. That's all you need to know for this tutorial. You don't have to worry too much about what is going on with this. Just know that this is generating an ID. Okay, so now we have our new expense. We're going to take a new line and we're going to type dispatch, since we want to dispatch an action. Open our braces, and we need to pass an object to the dispatch function. So we'll open our braces and we'll take a new line. And we're going to say a type. So this is going to be add expense. And then we'll do a comma. And then we'll say the payload is going to be our new expense. So this type is what the reducer is going to use to decide on how to update the state. So if we go into our app context, remember we created a reducer which has a switch statement with nothing else in it. We'll need to add a new case with the type of action we just added. We'll take a new line just above default. We'll type case, take a space, open our quotes, and do add expense. Type a colon, take a new line, and then this is going to return the new state. So the reducer has to return new state. It isn't going to do any clever merging for us. We need to say exactly what is going to be returned. So the first thing we're going to do is copy the existing state. So we're going to use the spread operator. So we'll do 3 dots and then type state. So now we've made a copy of the current state. We want to overwrite the expenses with a new array. So we'll copy the current expenses. So we'll do state.expenses. And then we're going to do a comma and type action.payload. What we're doing here is we're copying the existing state. We're going to overwrite that with a new expenses object. The new expenses object is going to be a copy of the current expenses array with whatever was in the payload added to the end of the array. So that's what this syntax is. Okay, so now if we try this, hopefully everything works. So we'll say house insurance, and the cost will be 200. Now if we save, you can see it's appeared at the bottom of our expenses list. Okay, so we'll do a recap just to make sure we understand what's happening. So in our add expense form, we have a form. When we type some stuff and click save, the onSubmit gets called. We create a new expense object in this, which has the same properties as what we need in state to display an expense. We then dispatch an action called add expense as the type. The payload is going to be the expense that we've just created. Dispatch action goes off to app context. The stuff that gets dispatched gets mapped to the action object, so we can use this to get the type and also the payload. So then the switch runs, it checks the action.type, it sees that the action type is add expense. So it's going to return this new state stuff. In here, we're taking a copy of the current state. We're overriding the expenses with a new expenses object. The new expenses object takes a copy of the current expenses and adds the expense, which is taken from the payload, which is taken from the action, to the end of the array. Whenever this returns, it updates our state in our app provider. Because the state in the app provider has changed, the value that gets sent to the components has also changed, and this tells the components to re-render themselves with the new data. Okay, so now that we have the budget working and we have the list of expenses working and we're able to add an expense, we can start looking at the remaining. So if you go into remaining.js, the first thing we need to do is get the budget and the expenses out of context. So we'll import our app context like we've done previously, and we'll import the use context hook from React. And then we'll do const, open our braces, and then we'll type expenses because we want to get the expenses, and the budget because we also want to take the budget, equals use context, open our braces, and pass in the app context. So now we've got our budget and our expenses taken from the context and assigned to their own variables. So in order to calculate the remaining, we need to take the total of all the expenses and subtract it from the budget. To do this, the first thing we need to know is the total of all the expenses in our list so far. So all we need for this is a simple variable, const total expenses. We're going to use the reduce function to take all the costs from each of the expenses in the expenses array and add them together. Remember, the expenses variable is an array, so we can do .reduce. The reduce function takes a function which gives us the total so far and the current item that the reduce function is currently on. So we'll pass these in as arrow functions. Now we'll open some braces, and in here we will do return total equals total plus item dot cost. Just after our function, we want to do a comma and then enter 0. So this is just an extra parameter that we pass to the reduce function that indicates the starting value. Okay, so now we know the budget and the total expenses. We can replace this hard-coded text with a subtraction. So we just say the budget minus the total expenses. So if we save this, we'll just refresh our app to take us back to the start. So we've got a total of 490 in our expenses, and our budget is 2,000. So if we subtract these two things, we get 1,510. So now if we add an expense, we'll say big expense, and then we'll say this one's 1,000. So now we're expecting the remaining to go down to 510 because we're adding an expense which is 1,000. So if we save this and we check our expense gets added to the list, and it does, and we check our remaining, and it has gone down to 510. So again, we're just taking the total sum of the costs of all the expenses and subtracting it from the budget to give us the remaining. And each time we add an item with a cost, it should subtract from the remaining. Okay, so the next piece we want to do in here is if the remaining goes below 0, then we want to display a red alert instead of the green alert. So in Bootstrap, it gives us an alert called danger, which is red. Previously we had success, which was green, and danger gives us a red. So all we have to do is create a variable which holds a conditional to decide whether to display the alert success or the alert danger. So we'll go ahead and do this. We'll do const alert type is equal to a ternary operator. So we're going to say if the total expenses is greater than the budget, then we want to return the string alert danger, else we want to return alert success, like so. And now as in our class name, we can dynamically apply the string by using a template string. So we will delete this and we will replace it with something similar by opening our braces, and then we're going to open some backticks. We're going to type alert, and then we're going to use a $sign and open some more braces. And then here we're going to have alert type. All this does is every time these variables change, it's going to create a new alert type string, and then we're just dynamically applying it to our class name. And depending on what string we're using, the color of the alert will change. So we'll try this. In our app, we're currently 1,510 remaining. So if we add a big expense of say 2,000, and save. We've gone into the negative, so this has changed the alert type to alert danger, which is red. We can do similar for the spent so far value. So if we go into expense total.js, we'll import our context in a similar way. App context from /context/app context. And we also need to import use context. And then we will get the expenses from our context by passing in app context to the use context hook and destructuring expenses. So now all we have to do is get the total, all of our expenses, and display them as a variable. So we've done this before. It's const total expenses equals expenses. And we're just going to reduce the expenses. And again, the reduce function gives us the current total and the item that the reduce function is currently on. We'll open some curly braces to create our function, and we'll just do return total plus equals item dot cost. So this is just going to add up all the costs for us. And then in our spent so far, all we need to do is add a curly braces and add the variable total expenses. If we save this and check, looks like we've done something wrong. So let's double back and see. So we're going to reduce, and it's going to be total plus item cost. Oh, okay. So don't forget to specify your starting value, or else we can get funny side effects like we see here. So just after we pass in our function, I'm going to do a comma and add a 0, since our starting value is 0. So now our spent so far is correctly totaling up our expenses. So now if we add an expense, we'll say cinema with a cost of 10. Now if we click save, you'll notice that the spent so far has gone up by 10 to 500, and the remaining has gone down by 10 to 1500. So each time we add an expense, this state gets updated in our app context.js. This updates the value, so our budget and our expenses could possibly get updated. This triggers all the components that are connected to our context to re-render and recalculate and display all these values. Okay, so now we're going to look at how do we delete an expense when the user clicks on this delete icon. So if we go to expense item.js, we have a delete icon that doesn't do anything at the minute. What we want to happen is when the user clicks on delete, it's going to dispatch an action and it's going to remove this particular expense from the context. So the first thing we'll do is import our context like we've done before, and we'll import the use context hook. Okay, so now we just need to pull dispatch from the context. We don't need anything from state in particular this time. So we'll just do const open our braces type dispatch equals use context and pass our context. And now we want to create a function called handle delete expense. So this will get called when the button gets clicked. So just create an arrow function, and in here we're going to say we want to dispatch an action. So remember, we pass an object to dispatch. Its type is going to be delete expense, and its payload is going to be props.id. So if you remember back to expense list.js, we rendered a list of expenses. Each expense has an associated ID. So this gets generated whenever we add the expense and gets stored in context. All the expenses which come from context has an ID. This ID is going to be used to find the expense that we want to delete. So it just gets passed in as a prop to expense item. So expense item, then we now have a function that will dispatch our action, and just make sure that you spell the action type correctly. So it's delete expense. And now in our icon, we're going to add a on click property, and we will pass in our handle delete expense function. So now if we try this, nothing happens because we haven't coded the reducer action that corresponds to this type. So if we go into app context, and in our app reducer, just below the case for add expense, we'll add a new case. And this one will be delete expense. And in here, we're going to return an object similar to what we did before. We have to always return the complete state from any of these cases. So we'll take a copy of the existing state and do a comma. And we're going to say we want to override the existing expenses with a new set of expenses. So we'll say expenses colon. And what we're going to do now is use the ID that we received as part of the payload from the action and filter out that ID from the existing list of expenses and return that new list. So we'll do state.expenses.filter. The filter function takes a function which gives us the current expense that it's currently on. And then we can do expense.id is not equal to action.payload. So remember, in expense item, whenever we dispatch the action, we're passing in the ID as the payload. So this is why we could do the comparison here against the expense ID and the action.payload. So this will return us a new array which does not have the expense that we just deleted in it. So if we save this, so if we go to Chrome, and if we delete holiday, for example, it's deleted holiday, but it's also deleted car service. So it looks like we have made a mistake somewhere. So let's go in and have a look. So our expenses uses the filter function to filter out any expenses which have the same ID as the payload ID. So let's look at our expenses in the initial state. And the problem is that the holiday and the car service both have the same ID of 13. So a quick fix is to change this to 14, and then we'll try this again. So now if we delete holiday, it should only delete holiday, and it does. Package, which we installed earlier to avoid clashes with IDs. But because this is hard coded as the initial state, then these RDs are fine. So you'll also notice that whenever we delete an expense, the values for spent so far and remaining also update. Okay, so the first challenge for you to try is if we look at the finished example, we have a budget, but we also have this edit button. So anytime I click edit, then I can change the budget. So I can type a number. And if I click save, it updates the budget and also updates my remaining. So your challenge is to add this button. Anytime the edit button is clicked, it should allow the user to update a value. Anytime it's saved, it should update the budget. So some tips to get started. Remember, in app context, we store the budget in state. You'll need an action that updates this budget. The second challenge is add a text box that lets the user search for a specific expense. So as I start typing, you can see it narrows down. And as I do backspace, you can see that the list slowly comes back. So some tips for this one is you'll have to write something in expense list.js. So instead of just rendering out the expense list, you want to have something else in your component that filters down based on a name. And the last tip I'm going to give you for this one is that the includes string function is used to check if a string contains a substring. Don't forget that the solution for both of these things are available on GitHub along with the completed example, which you can use for guidance or to check if you got the answer correct. That about wraps it up for this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.